Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm the psych coach, and today I'm going to be talking to you about being conflict avoidant. Being conflict avoidant means pretty much what it says on the tin, that you will avoid conflict. And there are lots of reasons why you may be conflict avoidant. A key thing to remember if you have a tendency to be conflict avoidant is that often things that you perceive to be a conflict may not necessarily be a conflict. In fact, they could just be a differing of opinion. They could just be an expression of something that someone else doesn't want to hear. It doesn't mean conflict. Conflict has got connotations of battle, of fighting. And perhaps you were brought up in a situation where that is what conflict meant to you. You know, why are you conflict avoidant? Well, perhaps that's your answer. Were you brought up in a situation where your voice wasn't allowed to be heard? And actually, if you did express yourself, or if you did express controversial feelings, you were really shut down and told to not assert them. Or were you in a situation in a family home or whatever upbringing you had where people ended up having huge arguments at the smallest bit of conflict? If that was the case, then of course the early messages that you've received when you're young is that conflict is bad, is that if there is a difference of opinion, or if you speak your mind and go against what someone else is saying, there will be a big argument. People may cry, there may be a huge fallout of that, there may be sulking for days, maybe you would be ignored or punished for having intervened or said something that you shouldn't have done. And what do those early experiences do? Well, they will reinforce to you that conflict is bad. And that will also reinforce to you that any kind of disagreement is bad. So have a think about your history. Have you got experiences? Maybe it doesn't go as far back as your childhood, but maybe it goes into relationships where any type of disagreement has led to huge conflict. Essentially a price that isn't worth paying for asserting yourself or speaking up or giving a differing opinion. But the thing is, those experiences have shaped you into being conflict avoidant, and actually, whilst they may have served you well as a child because it meant that you essentially lay low and you didn't get involved in conflict, or in a relationship it meant that things were calmer because you weren't speaking up, that you weren't asserting yourself, it probably doesn't serve you well in all areas of your life to be conflict avoidant. If you're conflict avoidant, it may mean that at work you haven't got the inclination to ask for a pay rise if you think you're deserving of one. It may mean that if you have a differing opinion about a project, you don't want to say in case it leads to a huge argument. It could also mean that even if you're in a shop and there's something that you want to complain about, you don't because you're worried it's going to lead into a full-blown row or where you're going to get ignored or thought of badly. Being conflict avoidant isn't always appropriate, and there are times where you will need to challenge yourself. So the first thing to do is to try and think about where your conflict avoidant desires come from. And that could be that you've been brought up in a household actually that didn't have very much conflict, but managed to successfully avoid any kind of conflict by always sweeping things under the carpet. And by constantly avoiding things, there was this facade of, well, everything is calm, everyone gets on, but actually that's not real. But that kind of upbringing can fuel a tendency to be conflict avoidant because you've got no experience of healthy conflict, of healthy disagreement. So have a think about what has potentially led you to being quite conflict avoidant, whether it's a relationship, your upbringing, and then think about, okay, how well does that serve me now? Is this something that serves me well, that really helps me succeed in life, that helps me get what I want to? Think about, are there situations where, had you been able to speak up or given your opinion on occasion, it might have been better for you? Without a doubt, if on occasions you're able to speak up and give your opinion, it's going to boost your self-confidence. So there we go. One benefit to being able to deal with conflict is that it's going to give you a bit more confidence. So consider where it comes from and how well it serves you now. And if you're able to recognise, okay, my incessant desire to avoid any perceived and I use the word perceived because it's not always conflict, to avoid any perceived conflict isn't serving me, now is the time for you to change it. You know where it came from, you know it served you a purpose historically, but now you need to tell yourself, I do not need to avoid all conflict. All conflict doesn't end in enormous rows. All conflict doesn't end in punishment. All conflict doesn't end in someone sulking and ignoring you. Sometimes conflict ends in a more positive way. So try and identify positive conflict that you've seen. Maybe you've been at a dinner table where two people have had a disagreement and actually they've just got over it. Maybe you've been at work where you've seen two colleagues butt heads about how something's going to be dealt with, and they've come up with a solution and moved on from it. There's no punishment, there's no sulking, there's no swearing or shouting. So look for the healthy models in your life. And then think about what things you can do to try and test yourself a little bit. When it comes to testing yourself and speaking up a bit or giving an oppositional opinion, you first of all need to challenge your idea that this is conflict. If you're conflict avoidant, there's a high chance that you are very, very hypersensitive about conflict. And a lot of the time, what you perceive to be conflict will not be what someone else perceives to be conflict. So be very careful about your use of language. Actually think to yourself, is this conflict or is this just a differing of opinion? Is this just someone speaking up against something they don't agree with that isn't necessarily really confrontational? Try and bring yourself back from thinking, this is conflict, this is bad, this is a fight. Okay, that's the biggest step. Question whether it is actually conflict. And even if you think, yes, it is conflict, if it feels within the realms of tolerance and it feels within the realms of you being able to challenge yourself to behave differently in that situation, then grab the opportunity. Give yourself a bit of a talking to and tell yourself, I'm now an adult, I don't need to respond as my younger self, or I'm now single and happy with a wonderful friendship group and I don't need to respond by walking on eggshells as I did in my last unhealthy relationship. Think I'm an empowered individual able to speak my mind, and I'm going to test how I deal with differing opinions coming back at me. Let me see if history does repeat itself and it ends up in World War III or a huge conflict, or let me see if we actually manage to get through it. And if you're able to speak your mind and get through what you perceive to be a conflict without things falling apart and feeling like you can't cope, that's a huge triumph. You're starting to rewrite history a little bit, where actually conflict doesn't mean terrible things. It can just mean a differing of opinion where two adults just get on with it and accept it. Once you start challenging your conflict avoidant tendencies, you'll start feeling more empowered to do it more and more. And if when it comes to conflict you feel as if you're going to get really upset, that your eyes are going to well up and you're going to cry, that's fine. You can allow yourself to feel those emotions. And sometimes people say, I don't want to do that in a conflict. I don't want to get upset and well up. If that's the case, then try and buy yourself a moment. Take yourself off to the toilet, gather your thoughts, remind yourself that you're an empowered person and all you're doing is discussing a difference of opinion, and then come back to the situation if you're able to. And if you do get upset, that's fine. We can get upset and still assert our opinion and give our input about something that might feel quite challenging. It's difficult to untangle the fear that there is around conflict if you've been brought up with a lot of conflict or if you've experienced it, but it is possible, and you can chip away at historical experience and essentially rewrite history and start training yourself that not all conflict is a really bad thing and that not all conflict is actually severe conflict. You can put these things into practice, tolerating exposing yourself a little more to it, tolerate speaking up, being accepting of your reactions sometimes, and compassionate to the person within you that's saying, this is really difficult. And actually each time you're able to get through a situation that you would have historically avoided or simply not spoken up at, give yourself a pat on the back and think, this is it, I'm doing things differently. If you've enjoyed today's tips, please do hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and I will give you plenty more tips on how you can use psychology on a day-to-day basis.